Before he passed, Johnny Carson finally opened up about the secrets Hollywood begged him to take to the grave. For 30 years, he ruled late-night television, the king of charm, wit, and effortless control. Every night, he invited America into his living room, making the biggest stars in the world feel like ordinary people, at least on camera. But behind that famous smile, Johnny was carrying the weight of stories he could never tell. He knew which celebrities' marriages were real and which were just for show. He knew who was genuinely in love and who was forced to fake it for the cameras. And more than anyone, he knew how much fear and pressure Hollywood's biggest icons lived under. Because if certain secrets ever got out, their careers and their lives would be over. In private, those close to Carson say he would sometimes talk about the contradictions he saw every day. The actors who sold fantasies on screen while quietly battling identities they could never reveal. The performers who smiled for millions, while silently hiding who they really were. It wasn't gossip to him, it was tragedy. By the end of his life, Carson reportedly began sharing bits of what he'd witnessed. Conversations, confessions, and private truths that had haunted him for decades. And among those stories were 5 names that stood out the most. 5 legends, 5 icons who helped define Hollywood itself, and 5 people who lived under the constant threat of exposure in a time when being yourself could destroy you. From carefully staged marriages and studio cover-ups to forbidden relationships that almost surfaced on The Tonight Show couch. These are the stories Carson could never tell on air. And the 5th one? Even Johnny himself admitted he never saw that one coming. He was Hollywood's golden boy, tall, confident, impossibly handsome. Rock Hudson wasn't just a movie star, he was the dream every 1950s woman had pinned on her wall. The perfect husband, the perfect romantic lead, the man who made love look effortless on screen. But Johnny Carson knew something the world didn't. When Hudson appeared on The Tonight Show, the chemistry felt easy, natural. The audience laughed. Hudson smiled. Carson asked his usual charming questions. Yet under the lights, behind that calm exterior, both men were holding their breath. Because Johnny knew the truth. And Rock knew that Johnny knew. It was one of Hollywood's best-kept secrets. Rock Hudson's entire life was a performance. Behind the scenes, studio executives had built an image so airtight that even whispers of the truth could have destroyed him overnight. Universal Studios didn't just manage his career, they controlled his story. His agent, Henry Wilson, even arranged a marriage to his own secretary, Phyllis Gates, to silence growing rumors. A lavender marriage, they called it, a polite Hollywood term for a lie. To the world, Rock was a devoted husband and a charming leading man. But to those in Carson's circle, the truth was heartbreaking. Every interview was like walking a tightrope. One wrong question, one misplaced laugh, and everything could crumble. And Johnny hated that. He'd later confide to friends that it never sat right with him, this unspoken game of pretending. But in the 1960s, even kindness could get you canceled. As the years passed, Hudson became more than a star. He was a symbol of a fantasy America refused to let go of. Yet behind the curtain, he was trapped, isolated, and terrified of exposure. Then came 1985. The news broke like an earthquake. Rock Hudson had died from complications related to AIDS. It was the first time many fans learned the truth, not just about his illness, but about the life he'd been forced to hide. And while most of Hollywood scrambled to rewrite history, Carson stayed silent. Those who worked with him said he was devastated, not because the secret had come out, but because it had to end like that. Johnny once told a producer, he spent his whole life pretending to be the man everyone wanted him to be. I just wish he'd had the chance to be himself. That was the kind of truth Carson carried. Not gossip, but quiet heartbreak for the people he'd seen torn apart by an industry built on illusion. And Rock Hudson's secret wasn't the only one, because while one man was forced into a marriage to protect his image, another legend was building a secret life right in front of Hollywood's cameras. Cary Grant, the secret at Bachelor Hall. He was the man every guy wanted to be, and every woman wanted to be with. Cary Grant was the definition of sophistication. Smooth voice, perfect posture, impeccable charm. On screen, he was the leading man, the gold standard of Hollywood elegance. But behind that polished smile, Johnny Carson knew there was another story. In private, Carson admired Grant deeply. He was one of the few guests who could match Johnny's wit, who could command a room without even trying. But what fascinated Johnny most wasn't what Grant said on stage. It was what he didn't. Because for years, rumors quietly swirled about Grant's life off-screen. Whispers that Hollywood's most desirable man wasn't living the kind of bachelor life his public image suggested. It all centered around one place, a house in Santa Monica. They called it Bachelor Hall. For over a decade, Cary Grant shared that home with fellow actor Randolph Scott, another star cut from the same square-jawed, all-American cloth. The two lived together openly enough that fan magazines printed photos of them having breakfast in bathrobes, lounging by the pool, working out side by side. To modern eyes, it looks obvious. Two men living together, sharing a domestic life. But in the 1940s, Hollywood spun it differently. Just two bachelors splitting rent, nothing more. Carson found that fascinating. And a little tragic. He'd once joked privately, those fan magazines were hiding the truth in plain sight. The whole world saw it. They just didn't know what they were looking at. Grant went on to marry 5 times, each union perfectly timed with studio publicity demands, red carpets, and film releases. To the audience, it looked like romance. To those behind the scenes, it was another performance. A former Tonight Show writer later said that Carson often reflected on those interviews with mixed emotions. He wasn't judging, he understood the fear. Back then, even a whisper could end a career overnight. But it disturbed him how completely the industry demanded its stars live a lie. He once described it to a friend as institutionalized pretending. You didn't just play a role on screen, you played one in life too. And for Cary Grant, that performance never truly ended. Even years after his death, the rumors never stopped. But Carson never joined in. Those close to him say he respected Grant too much to treat his private truth as gossip. To Johnny, Cary Grant wasn't a scandal. He was a symbol of what fame can take from a person. Because while the public saw a perfect gentleman, Carson saw a man quietly trapped inside his own legend. And that illusion, that line between truth and fiction, only grew darker with the next story. A romance so famous, so celebrated, that even Hollywood believed its own lie. For decades, their love story was the gold standard of Hollywood romance. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, two of the most respected names in film, bound together by what seemed like a timeless, forbidden devotion. They worked together on screen, they traveled together, and their chemistry was so natural that audiences believed every second of it. Hollywood called it the greatest love story ever told, but Johnny Carson knew that wasn't the whole truth. Behind the curtain, the story was much more complicated and much more strategic. In his private reflections, Carson reportedly said that their partnership wasn't about passion, it was about protection. Spencer Tracy was a devout Catholic who refused to divorce his wife no matter how long they lived apart. That gave him a perfect alibi, a reason to avoid the dating scene and keep rumors at bay. And for Hepburn, who had spent her life avoiding marriage and embracing her independence, the relationship gave her the same protection. Together, they created the perfect illusion, a romance the studios could celebrate and the public could idolize. It made them untouchable. But those close to Carson say he always found Hepburn fascinating for another reason. She didn't play the Hollywood game like other actresses. She wore pants when women were expected to wear gowns. She lived quietly in New York instead of attending every glamorous party. And the people closest to her, well, they weren't the kind of companions studio bosses would have approved of in that era. One of Carson's colleagues remembered him saying that Hepburn's genius wasn't in hiding. It was in redirecting. By letting the world focus on her devotion to Spencer Tracy, She could quietly live the life she wanted away from the cameras. Carson admired that. He saw in her something rare, a kind of bravery wrapped in control. While others lied outright, Hepburn built a myth that protected her truth. When Tracy died, Hepburn stayed by his side, nursing him through his final illness. The public saw a tragic love story, but Johnny saw something deeper. Two people who found comfort in each other's secrecy. Years later, as Carson reflected on his decades in television, he often mentioned that story when he talked about Hollywood's illusions. He said it was the best lie the industry ever told, because everyone wanted to believe it. To the audience, Hepburn and Tracy represented pure devotion. To Johnny, they represented survival. But not every secret came wrapped in love or elegance. Some were darker, lonelier, built on lies so complex that even the people telling them started to forget what was real. And one man, more than any other, embodied that quiet tragedy. To millions of Americans, he was the voice of truth. Week after week, Raymond Burr stood in front of the camera as Perry Mason, the brilliant defense attorney who always uncovered lies, exposed guilt, and fought for justice. He was powerful, commanding, the kind of man who seemed impossible to deceive. But Johnny Carson knew the deception was his own. Behind that authoritative voice was a life so carefully fabricated, it could have been a script from one of his own shows. When Burr sat across from Johnny on The Tonight Show, he came off humble, polite, thoughtful. He'd talk about his family, his war stories, his late wife, and the audience adored him for it. The widower, the hero, the gentleman. But none of it was true. Those who worked with Carson later said Johnny struggled through those interviews. Not because Burr was difficult, but because every detail he shared was part of a fiction. Burr had invented an entire alternate life. A wife who died tragically. A son who never existed. Even military service that records later proved never happened. It was all part of a shield. A narrative designed to make his private truth untouchable. Because Raymond Burr was gay, and in 1950s Hollywood, that was a secret worth lying for. Carson knew it. NBC executives knew it. And yet, the illusion continued because it had to. For more than 3 decades, Burr lived with his real partner, Robert Benavides, a younger actor he met on the set of Perry Mason. Together, they built a life that was invisible to the public. An orchid business, a vineyard, a quiet home where they could finally breathe. But in every interview, every talk show appearance, the fantasy had to continue. Carson reportedly told one producer, it was like interviewing a ghost, a man playing himself. He wasn't mocking him. He was heartbroken by what Burr had to endure. Here was a man who played the ultimate truth seeker, who fought every week for honesty and justice. And yet, in real life, had to build lie upon lie just to exist. That irony haunted Johnny. It was everything he hated about Hollywood. The cruelty of a system that demanded perfection while punishing authenticity. When Burr passed away in 1993, Benavides finally began to share their story. And for the first time, the fiction fell away. The widower with a tragic past was finally seen for who he really was. A kind, loyal, deeply private man who had lived half his life in hiding. Carson's friends later said it was one of the few Hollywood secrets that truly stayed with him. He'd shake his head and say quietly, the man who told the truth for a living couldn't tell his own. And as the years went on, Johnny became increasingly haunted by that pattern, the constant tension between public image and private pain. Because not every star hid their truth in shame. Some embraced it, quietly, defiantly, turning scandal into art and illusion into power. And one man, more than anyone, blurred that line so brilliantly that even Carson didn't know where the act ended, and the truth began. He was the rebel who changed everything. The raw energy, the mumbling intensity, the dangerous charisma. Marlon Brando didn't act, he became. From A Streetcar Named Desire to The Godfather, he was Hollywood's embodiment of truth. a man who stripped away pretense and gave emotion a face. But behind the scenes, Johnny Carson knew that Brando's truth was far more complicated. When Brando appeared on The Tonight Show, he carried himself like a storm contained in a man. Unpredictable, magnetic, impossible to control. Carson admired him, but also sensed the tension beneath the surface. Because even as Brando spoke about honesty, integrity, and being real, he was hiding a part of himself that the world wasn't ready to see. In private conversations, Carson reportedly referred to Brando as the most honest liar in Hollywood. He meant it as a paradox, a man whose performances were pure truth, but whose life was built around careful silence. By the time Brando hit his stride in the 1950s, he'd become the face of a new kind of masculinity. Unpolished, emotional, and fearless. The press painted him as a womanizer, a heartbreaker, a man whose lovers couldn't keep up with his appetite. But those close to Johnny knew he'd heard a different story, one whispered through Hollywood for years. Rumors suggested Brando's relationships extended far beyond what the tabloids dared print. Some said he'd shared more than just a friendship with James Dean. Others claimed his romantic life was fluid, complex, a reflection of his refusal to fit into anyone's expectations. Carson didn't judge him. In fact, he respected him for it. He saw Brando as someone trapped between two eras. The fearless artist living in a time that punished honesty. In later years, Brando himself began to hint at it. In interviews, he said plainly that he'd had relationships with both men and women, shrugging off the revelation with the same casual rebellion that had defined his entire career. But Carson knew how hard it had been to get there. To Johnny, Brando represented the ultimate irony. The man celebrated for exposing truth through his art was forced to hide his own. He once told a Tonight Show producer, Brando could tear his soul open on camera, but off camera, he had to lock it shut. That stuck with him, because Brando wasn't just another secret in Hollywood's closet. He was a symbol of everything Carson had come to understand about fame. The illusion, the performance, the pain of living inside a story you didn't choose. Brando's rebellion wasn't just against the studio system. It was against the lies that system demanded. And for Carson, that realization was both powerful and painful. After decades of interviews, he had seen it all. The lies, the masks, the heartbreak behind the laughter. But as he neared the end of his life, Johnny began to see Hollywood for what it truly was, a glittering stage built on secrets, and the people who paid the price for keeping them. By the time Johnny Carson retired, he had spent over 3 decades sitting across from the most famous faces in the world. He'd laughed with them, teased them, listened to their stories, and carried the ones they couldn't tell. To the audience, The Tonight Show was laughter before bedtime. But to Johnny, it became something else. A mirror reflecting the loneliness, fear, and pressure behind Hollywood's perfect smiles. In his final years, he reportedly spoke more openly with close friends about the double lives he'd witnessed. Not out of gossip, but grief. He wasn't angry at the lies. He was heartbroken by what forced them. He saw what happened to Rock Hudson, a man who gave the world joy but died in silence. He remembered Cary Grant's charm, masking decades of isolation. He thought about Katharine Hepburn's clever disguise of dignity and distance. He couldn't forget Raymond Burr, the man who lived truth on screen but couldn't live it in real life. And he admired Marlon Brando, the rebel who, in the end, didn't just break Hollywood's rules. He rewrote them. Carson once told a friend late in life, "They all wore masks. Maybe I did too." That was the burden of fame he came to understand. That in Hollywood, truth wasn't currency, illusion was. And sometimes the greatest performances didn't happen on stage or screen. They happened in real life. He carried those stories to his grave, not out of shame, but respect. Because Johnny Carson knew something few others did. Behind every glittering spotlight, there's a shadow. Behind every perfect smile, there's a story no one dares to tell. And when he finally stepped away from the camera for good, he left those secrets where they belonged, with the man who'd spent his life keeping them safe. If you found these stories as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps us keep uncovering the hidden history of old Hollywood. Which revelation surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe because there are still so many stories from Carson's couch that the cameras never caught. Until next time, thanks for watching.